Welcome to the Live Like It's True podcast. I'm Shannon Popkin. I'm an author, a speaker, and a Bible teacher. And here on the show, I'm inviting you to drink deeply of the true story of the Bible and live like it's true. God chose to reveal himself through a book filled with interesting, astonishing, true stories, which collectively tell the story of him. I like to think of each story in the Bible as a container for truth. Once you know the story, you can easily pull it down from the shelf of your mind, rehearse the truth, and share it with a friend. So I hope that this episode will inspire you to better know the story, share the story, and live like it's true. Lara D'Entremont, welcome to Live Like It's True.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Well, we're going to have a great conversation. Let me just introduce you to our listeners. I'll read your bio here that you are a mom and a wife and a mom to three. You call them little wildlings. I love that. You're from Nova Scotia, Canada, and your first book, A Mother Held, released this February. It's a collection of essays on the early days of motherhood and anxiety for you. I just wanted to give our listeners an insight into your life. You are the mom of a 6-year-old and 3-year-old twins. All three are boys, correct?
Yes.
Mother of three. And how long have you been married?
8 years.
8 years. Okay. So just give us a glimpse into your summer. What did today look like as the mom of 3 boys?
Today looked like playing outside while it was partially raining, climbing everything in sight and wandering the woods and beating down paths in all of the brush and trees.
That sounds like magical. So you and I don't remember who reached out to who, if I reached out to you or you reached out to me, but I remember talking about, what would you like to talk about? What are some of your favorite narratives in the Bible? And you sent me back a list of ideas and I'm like, Lara, we have all the same thoughts and ideas. We are like on the same wavelength. I was like, oh my goodness, this is incredible. So did you feel that way too?
I did. It was so funny. It's like, yeah, we're very similar personalities.
Yes. And especially, we're going to talk about the parable of the talents, but you were drawing out some conclusions about comparison for that. And I'm like, oh my goodness, me too. I haven't heard anybody use this parable to talk about comparison, but obviously you were seeing some application there, right?
Yes, because I think, we can often look at what somebody else has been given in life, whether it be a certain amount of children or a certain amount of financial stability, or maybe just the skill sets. You look at maybe a homesteading mom who's able to raise 6 kids and 20 chickens and a cow and all the things and make her own bread. Meanwhile, you feel like, goodness, I have one child and does nothing all day and I'm struggling. And we think, what's wrong with me? And like, why can't I be like her? And I should be like her. And I think the parable of the talents reminds us that when God looks at our obedience and our faithfulness, he's not comparing us against all the other people. He's looking at us. When the master looked at each of his servants, he didn't say to the one he had given 2, he's like, why didn't you make the same amount as the one that I gave 6? He knew that wouldn't be possible. He knew that he should have different expectations based on what he gave each servant.
So true. Okay. So we're going to get to all of those thoughts, but I just wanted to talk first about how comparison has surfaced in your heart as a mom. I remember all the things that you just mentioned. Like I remember, noticing what my friends were feeding their kids, the activities they were doing with their kids. Some of them were homeschooling and I was like sending them to school, but I couldn't even keep it together, just different. I couldn't even be on time to drop them off to school, that sort of thing. I'm just wondering, like, what are some of the ways that you have found yourself comparing with other moms?
Very similar to you. I've compared what kind of activities I'm doing. And like, you look at the moms who are like, oh, we have a 6-month rotation of toys or like 3-month rotation. And I'm like, I am lucky that we get all the toys cleaned up at the end of the day. And at the toys
Yeah.
get put away right, let alone like making sure that I have a schedule of rotating out our toys.
Oh
Um,
my goodness.
so yeah, I find there are just so many ways that we compare ourselves as women in general too. Like we look at our bodies or we look at the, our hair, like, oh my goodness, how does she still have beautiful thick hair and I am getting grays already? Like this doesn't make any sense. We
Yeah.
look at goodness, she had this many children and I've only had this many, yet her body seemed to snap right back into shape each time. And how we're, like you said, taking care of our children. How many activities do we have them enrolled in? How well are they doing in those activities? We start to
Hmm.
compare and think, if I'm not doing all the exact same things as that mom over there who's doing so well, then it must mean that I'm doing poorly and God must think I'm doing poorly. And if
Hmm.
only I could look just like this mom over here, then I would be faithful.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So whenever I speak at moms groups on this topic of comparison, often I'll run down a list of things and everybody starts feeling uncomfortable because I'll be like, which moms homeschool? Which moms send their kids to school? Which moms vaccinate? Which ones don't vaccinate? Which
Yes.
moms, breastfeed? Which ones bottle feed? Which ones spank? Which ones don't spank? And I'll just have them raising their hands until everybody's like, oh, this feels awful. And then I'm like, okay, I want you to look around the room and see, did you raise your hand exactly the same way as anyone else? Like the answer is usually no. There's never going to be a way that we're all alike. And yet comparison causes us to look over at other people and the way they're doing their parenting or, how many kids God has given them and either feel superior or inferior based on what we see. And yet, like, that's just going to cause us to pull away because when we feel inferior to somebody else, we don't want to sit next to her. She makes us feel bad about how we're doing, right? If we feel
Right.
superior to somebody else, we want to pull away from her too because like, oh, she's beneath me. And so we create these moms groups or these, let's meet at the park or let's get together with other moms because we want to connect. And yet comparison always drives us apart from each other. I think what we're going to talk about in this parable is going to drop some of those barriers between us. I really see that in this parable. I just want to give our listeners kind of a backdrop for this story. This comes right at the very end of Jesus's ministry. He's been with the disciples for about 3.5 years now. And so he's having this conversation with them about what's going to happen after he leaves. And they've asked these questions like, well, how are we going to know what to do and what's going to happen while you're gone? And right in the middle of that context, he tells this story. We call it the parable of the talents. So I wondered if you could read just the first couple verses. Could you read Matthew 25:14-15?
It will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away.
Okay, so here's Jesus telling a story and he sets it up. He can tell the story any way he wants to. So what do you think is interesting about the way that Jesus sets up the story? Like what's surprising here?
He sets it up by saying a man went away on a journey. And like you were saying, he's preparing them for when he has to leave. And so he's saying, while I'm gone, I'm going to entrust things to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a master and there's a servant. And I think there's a lesson for us there too, right? Anything that we've been given, it doesn't belong to us. It feels like it does, but it's actually entrusted. That's the word that's used here. He called his servants. He's the master. We're the servants and he's going to entrust them. And I think it's interesting too, there's a simpler way to tell this story. If Jesus is just trying to make the point that, be faithful with what you've entrusted, don't be like the guy who buried it, be like the guy who invests. We're going to get to that here in a second. He could have told a 2-person story, where one
Yeah.
buries, one invests. Instead, he tells a 3-person story. Like he could have also told a 3-person story where they all got equal amounts. Why do you think he tells a story where they each get unique amounts?
I think because he wants us to see we're not all going to be 5-talent people. And it's okay to be the 2-talent people. There's nothing wrong
Yeah.
with that. I've talked with a counselor before and saying, the idea of being ordinary or being just okay, like it feels cringy and it doesn't feel good and it feels like failure. But there's nothing wrong with that. I grew up in the age of youth rallies where it was always about do something crazy and extraordinary for God. And it was about go and on the big mission trips and go do this. And like, we were just called to be like revolutionary things for God. And while there's nothing wrong with that, there was never talk about what about being the ordinary person, and it was to the point that if you were just living an ordinary life, being a mom, being a stay-at-home mom or being a working mom or, just a guy working on a lobster fishing boat, you were living less than. You weren't living the way God expected you to. But I think by putting in there that it's not just the 5-talent person and the 1-talent person, he also shows like there are some people who are given 2 talents and it's okay.
Absolutely. And I mean, you've got to remember too that the disciples are listening as Jesus tells the story. And they're naturally finding themselves in this story. And so, as he sets it up where there's one who has 5, one who has 2, everybody's thinking, okay, who's the one with 5? Obviously Peter, right? Obviously
Right.
he's the 5-talent guy, but which one am I? And I always think like, well, what about Thaddeus, or what about, one of those disciples who just didn't get mentioned as much. What about them? They're probably like, oh yeah, I'm the 2-talent guy, or the 1-talent guy. And so, I mean, I think they're leaning in to see what's going to happen. Their master, if he goes away and he gives them different amounts, I think it's important that we recognize he gives to each according to their ability. And that word ability, the word is dunamis. It's like power. It's like, how much can you carry? It's what's your capacity level. And so he knows, first of all, he knows what each of their capacity levels is. He doesn't mix it up and give the guy who can't carry as much more and the one who can less. He gives to each according to his ability. And so, our master knows that about us. He knows what we can carry, right? He knows that Lara at this point can handle 3 little boys, and he knows what I can handle and what each of us can handle. So Lara, I looked up what a talent is. It's actually a weight or a measurement. And so it's equal to about 65 or 70 pounds. So it would be like a measurement of gold or a measurement of silver, so like, when he gave the 1-talent guy 1 talent, that would be 65 pounds of, like, if it's gold, I think at one point I looked it up and it was like 1 talent would be almost $1 million. So just because he gets less, it doesn't mean he's given little. It's like, he's been given a lot, right? The 1-talent guy and the 5-talent guy has been given even more because he has a greater capacity level. All right, so let's go on and read what they do with these talents that the servants, have been entrusted. Could you read 16 through 23?
He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he who also had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.
Okay. So that's like this phrase that even people who don't read the Bible or follow, God's ways, they know this whole good and faithful servant thing. Like, it's kind of made its way into pop culture, right? And this is the story where that saying comes from. Well done, good and faithful servant. So what do you think is interesting or surprising about how Jesus develops this story?
Something I was noticing as I read is he says the exact same words to both servants. And like, it's not like, oh, you've been faithful over a lot to the 5 guy and you've been faithful over a little to the 2 guy. You both have been faithful over a lot. and you will both receive more. And he calls them both good and faithful. And he says to both of them, you will both enter my joy. It's not, again, back to that comparison thing. We might be tempted to compare ourselves. I'm only a 2-talent Christian and she's a 5-talent Christian, it seems. God's going to be more pleased with what she does. But that's not the case. He has the exact same words for the 1 with the 2 as he does for the 5.
If you love this podcast, there's another one that I think you should check out. It's one of my favorites, hosted by my friend Erica Van Heitzma and her sister Veronica. It's called The Context and Color of the Bible. Now, if you've heard Erica here as a guest on Live Like It's True, you know that she loves the Bible. Erica holds a degree in Bible and theology from the Moody Bible Institute and also an MA in historical geography and archaeology from Jerusalem University College. So she brings to every episode of Context and Color of the Bible not only a wealth of knowledge, but also a passion for the truth. As Erica and Veronica talk through their various series on Jonah, the parables, the holy days, and more, their understanding of the Jewish context for these texts will help bring color to the black and white pages of your Bible. So I hope you'll check out Context and Color of the Bible podcast today. Yes, I saw that exact same thing. In fact, I remember the time I was first studying this, I copied the words and put them side by side on my screen because I just wanted to make sure, are they exactly the same? And it was exactly the same. What the master said to the 2-talent and the 5-talent guy. And he says to both, you've been faithful over a little. I mean, gosh, it seems like they've both been faithful over a lot, but
Right.
they're going to have even more responsibility. And I think this doesn't match what we usually think of. Like, this is not the way of the world where the person who produced way, way, way more than the other person gets the same commendation. Do you agree?
Yes, exactly. Well, it's kind of like the parable where the people, like, master hired servants to work in his vineyard, and some of them started at the beginning of the day and some of them started partway through the day. And at the end of the day, he gave everybody the exact same amount. And the ones who had worked longer were like, wait a minute, something's not right here.
Yeah. Yeah. They're like, you have made him equal to me. And they were not pleased about it. That doesn't happen in this story, but it does kind of set us back. Like, wait, what? It's like the 4.0 student and the 2.0 student both get the same, I don't know, reward, or the guy who, makes 16 points for the soccer team and the one who makes 4 points gets the same, it's like, how does that work where they're both given the same response from the master? What I notice and see is the 2-talent guy almost seems like that's where Jesus wants our attention to be drawn to, because he is the one who has less, but he still invests, right? Do you ever find, Lara, that when you're the one in the room who has less to give, that you're like more reluctant and like hold back a little bit, like, well, I don't want to invest what I've been given. I'll just let somebody else use their gifts or their talents. Yeah.
Well, yeah, definitely. Because that comparison comes up and you think, oh, well, nobody really wants to hear from me anyway. I'm not as good as this person. Might as well let them handle this because I'm obviously not as talented or as good at that as them.
Exactly. I remember I was invited to a luncheon for some people who do kind of what we do, writers, speakers, podcasters. And I remember this was before I began this podcast. And I remember on the way there thinking, I think someone told me that a couple of these women who are going to be there are podcasters. So maybe I could ask them some questions, I could learn, because I kind of had in the back of my mind that the Lord was inviting me to start a podcast. Well, when I got to this luncheon, somebody said something, I don't remember, it made me think, I think they have a pretty big following, this other person at the table, a couple of them. And so under the table, I'm like looking them up on social media. So embarrassing, right? I'm like
I'd be doing the
looking
same.
and looking them up and I'm like, oh my word, these women have like hundreds of thousands of followers and, huge podcast reach. And I just found myself thinking like, okay, the world does not need another podcast. They've got it handled. Why? This was a silly idea. I'm not even going to ask them my questions. Let's just put that little idea to rest. Like they're the real influencers or whatever. Let's let them do their work and I will just go home and stay quiet, And then, I don't know, it was maybe 4 or 5 months later, I was preparing to speak for a group and it was this passage that I was going to be talking on, the parable of the talents. And so it's always my, habit when I'm going to speak somewhere to like pray my way through the passage and whatever I'm going to be giving to others. I want to like bring my heart to the Lord and invite him to expose anything that I need to deal with before I speak on it with others. So I got to this part where, the guy buries his talent, which we're going to get to next. And I was like praying and I'm like, Lord, I don't think I've buried anything. I'm really investing a lot here, but you're free to convict me if there is anything I've buried, that I haven't served you. And as I was praying this prayer, my phone, I shouldn't have had my phone near me, but I got a little alert and it was a message to that group of us that were at that luncheon. And it was one of those women who had a really huge following. So I just glanced at my phone. I saw her name and I thought, I'm not going to look at that right now. And I went back to my prayer. Okay, Lord, where was I? Is there anything that I have buried that some way I haven't invested? And I felt like all of a sudden my eyes like flew open. I'm like, oh my goodness, Lord, are you reminding me about that podcast idea? Are you reminding me that, because I was the one in the room who didn't have a huge following and I was like, okay, I'm just going to be quiet, sit down, not invest, they've got it handled. Are you asking me to start a podcast? And I felt like maybe that's, I didn't have time to pray about it thoroughly, but I'm like, okay, I'm going to pray about this, but that just seems crazy. But over time, as I prayed, I did sense this conviction that yes, the Lord wanted me, even though like I was the 2 talent person and they were the 5 talent, or I was even the 1 talent person. Like he didn't want me to bury this. Like just because I have less, it doesn't mean I have little. I still have an opportunity to invest, And again, I think when I'm in a room where there are people who are way more talented, way more skilled, have way more money, whatever it is, I'm like, yeah, you go ahead. You serve the Lord with that. And I'll just sit down and be quiet. Have you ever had an experience like that?
Yeah, I think as writers, it can often come up because how many people
Mm.
are there out there writing in general? How many books have been written? And we know there's nothing new under the sun. Every time I've had a book idea, it's like, you have to, when you're getting ready to pitch a book to a publisher, you have to write down, what are some comparable titles, some other books like yours, and how is yours different?
They
And
make us
that's when,
compare. They make us compare,
right.
right?
And that's when you start to have all this doubt, like, oh my goodness, there are already so many books on anxiety, or there are so many books on motherhood. The world doesn't need another book on that
Yeah.
topic. And there are
Yeah.
these people who have done it way better than me, or these people who have a way bigger platform than me. Why on earth am I trying? I might as well give up.
Yeah.
And trying to remember that God equips us to carry what he gives us, like you were saying, and to stop the comparison and to say, you've given me this message. I don't know what the purpose is for. You've given me this heart and this passion for it. Whether or not this book proposal gets accepted, or that the fact that there's 30 other books on similar topics, that doesn't mean that I need to close my mouth and never share about it. Maybe I can share about it with a small group locally, or maybe I can share about it through my website, or maybe I can share about it one-on-one with in a mentoring or discipleship situation. I think we get stuck with comparing ourselves, that, like you said, we completely back off and say, better, therefore I don't even want to try. And we need to remember it's not about comparing ourselves, but rather that we seek to be faithful with what we've been given in the way
Yeah.
that God has equipped us to carry it.
Yes. I want to circle back to that idea of being faithful here in a minute, but I just want to give you an opportunity. You know, you created this book, you pitched a book, you saw there were 30 other titles that were similar, you know, maybe Christian books written by women who wanted to talk about anxiety and motherhood. Have you had anybody who has read your book respond and tell you how much it meant to them?
Of course, yeah. So many people have responded and said, I'm so grateful for this. And, it felt like I was reading something I could have written. I'm so grateful that you wrote this. And that's the thing, too, a friend pointed out to me was, yeah, maybe author has written this book like it. So there are people who have never read that author, who don't even know who that author is, despite how big their platform is. But they'll read your book. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe you'll be the bridge to point them to that other great book, because we often think of the classics too and think, oh, I'll never be a classic. I could never write like the classics. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Yeah,
Yeah,
you probably won't ever be a classic. You'll never be a Tolkien. You'll never be a C.S. Lewis, but
exactly.
you might draw people to those authors and to their beauty of words. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that's the point, right? It's not that we somehow are become the focal point of everything. It's meant to
Yeah.
be faithful to give glory to Jesus. And, if
Yep.
giving glory to Jesus means we point to somebody else who gives glory to Jesus, that's
Yeah.
good too.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, in this story, the 2 talent guy was never going to be the 5 talent guy. He just wasn't. And what you said is exactly right. They were both told, well done, good and faithful servant. And I love that it's well done, good and faithful. It's not like well done, good and productive or good and prosperous, or good and I don't know, whatever, fill in the blank. It's well done, good and faithful. It's like faithfulness is what is rewarded. And our rewards, it's not like what we're producing. If we've produced more, that's going to produce more reward for us. It's like, no, faithfulness is what is rewarded. And you can be faithful no matter what you've been entrusted. So it's like the great leveler. Every single one of us can be told, well done and good and faithful servant, because every single one of us can be faithful with what we in particular have been entrusted. And so, I mean, I love that about this parable. It gives me such hope. Like if I'm a 2 talent person, if I'm a 1 talent person, if I'm a 5 talent person, I can be faithful. Do you ever feel like people are not being honest about how much they've been entrusted? Like maybe they're expecting more of themselves than the Lord does, or they're expecting less of themselves than the Lord does?
Yeah, I think so. I think that can definitely be a part of it too, that we have too high of expectations for ourselves. And, that's when burnout happens, right? Because we're trying to carry more than what we're capable of. And God's saying, there's a reason why I gave you what I gave you,
Yeah.
and the reason why you're burning out is because you're trying to do more than you can. I remember,
Yeah.
especially when my twins were first born, I wanted to still be doing all the things. Meanwhile, I had newborn twins who were preemies who had to be fed every 2 hours around the clock. And
Right.
one of them was really struggling with colic. And I also had a 2-year old who needed attention and help and care, and
Yeah.
I still expected myself to be able to perform in the same way I did back when I only had one child, and God was continually reminding me, no, you have been entrusted with these children. They are your first priority. I don't
Yeah.
expect you to take care of all the other things like you used to, because that
Yeah.
things change, right? I remember as I was trying to get everyone wrangled out the door one day, I laughed to myself and thought, you know, when God gives a woman twins, he should also give her extra arms. But the irony the irony of it is he's given us the extra arms and hands and feet
Mm,
through the church. And he's
yeah.
calling me to rely on those people rather than compare myself to them and say, oh, they're managing well and doing it all on their own. I want to be able to manage well and do everything they're doing. Instead, he gave us this church to say, I need help because you know what? I'm not capable of carrying what some people are. And I need help carrying this.
Yes, it's so good. And I think that some of us just need to have an honest conversation with the Lord about what our capacity level is, right? You mentioned seasons. Every season of life is different and our capacity level can change. I mean, there may be somebody listening who, yeah, she's the mother of newborn twins and she just has a lower capacity level. Or maybe she has a special needs child, or maybe she's the caregiver of aging parents, or maybe, she herself has chronic pain or something. I don't know what it is, but if we just continue to drive ourselves because of what we want to accomplish, and our Lord knows he gives to us according to our capacity. All he asks is that we be faithful with what we've been entrusted. And so I just think some of us are putting more demands on ourselves than even the Lord has. I remember in Nancy DeMoss Wagamuth's book, Lies Women Believe, one of the most poignant lies for me was the one that says, I can't accomplish everything on God's list for me for the day. Something to that effect. It's like, no, the Lord hasn't put too much for me to do on my list. Like I'm the one who loads up my list with things. He knows exactly what he's asked me to do with my day, with my year, with the season of life. And it's, I'm the one who pushes myself to produce more. But no, good. Well done, good and faithful servant. Okay, let's just take a minute and talk about the one talent servant. And so let me just summarize this part of the story. So the last one, the one who received one, he comes forward and he's like, I knew that you were the kind of guy who reaps where you didn't sow. You gather where you didn't scatter seed. And I was afraid. So I went and hid my talent in the ground. And so I dug it up. Here it is. I'm bringing it to you. And this time the master is not saying, well done, good and faithful servant. He says, you wicked, slothful servant. You knew these things about me. You should have taken your money and invested it. And so, that's when he says, take his talent, give it to the guy who has 10. And he cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness in that place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. So this part of the story is interesting. I want to make clear, this is the part of the story that is not talking about a believer. That doesn't fit with the overarching narrative. And so it's not like if we don't do enough, then God is going to not let us enter heaven, right? Like, I just want to be really, really clear about that. This guy represents the unbeliever. But I think like what's interesting is from my perspective, and I want to hear yours here in just a second, but I don't see this man treating the master like the master. It's almost like he thinks, he's in the place to evaluate the master. And he's like, you're scary. You aren't doing this right. And I'm just not going to, I'm just going to bury it because I'm afraid of the consequences. And so for all of us, anybody who's going to be told, well done, good and faithful servant, it starts with treating the master like the master. But what else is interesting or surprising about this part of the story, Lara? God's promises are like a set of parentheses. The first one is when he makes the promise. The second one is when he keeps it. And you never have one without the other. But often there's this long stretch between the two, much longer than we first imagined, right? That's what we see in Sarah's story found in Genesis 12 through 21. God promised a son, but in this wide stretch between the parentheses, she wondered, would God keep his promises? Could he? I'm Shannon Popkin, inviting you to come find the answer to those questions, both for Sarah and yourself, in my brand new 6-week Bible study titled Shaped by God's Promises, Lessons from Sarah on Fear and Faith. Find out how you too can be shaped by God's promises in the waiting.
I actually love that you say that because, yes, I think many Christians get that wrong and think, I could be that one talent servant. And then I'm afraid that God's going to completely disown me because I wasn't faithful enough. But the reality is it's about his faithfulness. That's what we're saved by, not by our faithfulness, but the fact that he was perfectly faithful. He literally carried the cross. He literally obeyed where we could not. He obeyed the full law. And that's where our rest is. That's where we are saved, not by how much we do or how much we produce at the end of the day. And so I think that is a really important thing to remember. And like you said, I think that's a really good point, that this is somebody not treating the master as the master, because the unbeliever, like you said, they see all of their stuff as theirs,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to handle it the way they want to. And they judge God for the way he portrays himself and for the way he wants us to operate. And they don't like the way he calls us to be. And so they choose to go their own way and to do things their own way. You know, that's what Romans 3 is all about. Nobody obeys, nobody listens. And so that's why we need the true good and faithful servant who is perfectly faithful and perfectly good to save us. And then we rest in that as we seek to be faithful with what he's given us.
Oh, that's so good. Yes. So true. It starts with making the master, but then treating what he's entrusted us like it belongs to him, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's one of the ways that we live like this story is true, is like treating the master like the master. You know, he's the one who has entrusted everything to us. And that's where it begins, is like, you know, anything I've been given, it's been given to me by a master who knows my capacity level and who gives to me differently than somebody else. What else do you see? How else can we live like the story is true?
Yeah, I think continually reminding myself of what this is what God's entrusted to me right now, because I easily get frustrated with myself and what I'm capable of and my
Mm,
weaknesses and my limits, right? And I start to think of my limits as evil and as bad. But I really love the book You're Only Human by Kelly Capek. And that was really transformative for me, as he reminded us that our limits are good. Our limits are God given. They're not something bad that we should be trying to get rid of and eradicate, but rather our limits are one of the ways that God calls us to rely on him and to rely on his church that he's given us. And
mm,
so for me, it's constantly remembering I am very, very limited. And that doesn't mean that God's looking at me differently. Right now, I feel like a two-talent Christian, and I need to look to the five-talent Christians around me to help me carry my talents I
mm.
have. And that's okay. That's what God expects. It's the way he made his church to operate.
Yeah. I mean, you've got your mom, was it your mom or your mother-in-law there watching your kids
My
tonight?
mom, yeah.
Yeah. And so you're living the story, right? You're saying, I do not have the capacity to do a podcast interview and wrangle my boys at the same time. So like, here's an extra
Exactly.
set of hands, right? And I love that. So you actually are living like it's true. Anything else that you wanted to add? Like how would we, you know, live like it's true that God gives to each differently, you know, like that he gives one 5, 1, 2, and another 1. How does that affect the way we think about ourselves?
I think sometimes we need to either put our blinders on and stop looking at what everyone else has been given and just focus on what's in front of me. But then also stop thinking, like, when we look at somebody else and think to immediately compare. Instead, think of thanking God and seeing, wow, look at how God's uniquely equipped her. And then also look at how God's uniquely equipped me for a different season, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I see moms who are like homesteaders, and I think, goodness, what's wrong with me that I can't have 30 chickens and I can't milk a cow or goat and make my own cheese and like grow a huge garden that supplies our family for the whole summer and winter. Like, why can't I possibly do that too? But then I remember, but also God's equipped me to be a writer, and that takes up a lot of my time. Whereas for
Mm-hmm.
them, God's equipped them to be a homesteader and to, cultivate his earth. And he's equipped me to proclaim his word through the written word. And
Yeah.
so it's not that one is better or one that's less than. It's about,
Yeah.
this is how God has shaped me, and this is how he's made me to carry what he's given me. And that's okay.
Yes. And I think when we can set our sights on being faithful, if that really is what we're after, like how can I be faithful and how can she be faithful? I think that turns us back into sisters where we can cheer for each other instead of, you know, compare and compete with each other. It's like if I'm faithful and she's faithful, like the 2-talent guy and the 5-talent guy side by side are each told, well done, then that can be true of me and the person next to me who's like the homesteader making her own butter or whatever, making her own cheese. It's like, because I don't do any of those things either, Lara. So when people compare themselves with us as writers, like I'm just doing what I've been entrusted with, right? I'm just like, this is the gift God gave me. And I just want to be faithful. And I want you to be faithful. And I want all of our listeners to be faithful. I remember this time when our family was going through a really hard time, and one of our kids was struggling. And I remember him being at an event, and something didn't go well. It was like a school event. Something didn't go well. And there was a woman who had to kind of patch things up, and it was embarrassing for my child, and it was embarrassing for me. And it was just a really, it was just like you're trying to shepherd your child through a difficult phase, and things weren't perfect. And it just, in that moment, it was obvious that things weren't perfect in our lives. And so I remember seeing her like in a parking lot and thinking, I want to go. I heard what had happened, and I wanted to go thank her. But this woman, we'll call her Stacy, just seemed like perfect. She looked perfect. Her house was perfect. Her family looked perfect. Like her kids were always, straight A's, great at sports, whatever it is. They just seemed perfect. And I felt so inferior to her. But I thought, man, I don't, I didn't want to go talk to her. I didn't want to go thank her, but I chose to humble myself and do it. And so I go over, and I'm like trying to fight back tears because it was just like this hard thing. And so, I just told her, I'm so sorry this happened. Thank you for helping patch things up, helping shepherd in that moment. And she puts her hand on my shoulder, and she looks into my eyes, and she says, Shannon, I love your child. And we would do anything for your family. Like there's nothing we wouldn't do. And I just it was just this really special moment where this woman that I had so put up on a pedestal, all she was doing, she's like reaching into my life, basically saying, I hope you'll just be faithful. I want to be faithful with what I've been entrusted in. I just want that for you. And anything I can do to help you, to be faithful in this place that God has you. It was just this moment where I felt like it was like a sisterhood moment, it meant so much to me. And so I just want that for myself. I want that for you. I want that for our listeners. Just could we reach into somebody else's life and say, I hope you'll be faithful with what you have been entrusted. I want to be faithful with what I've been entrusted. And all of us, I just want for us to follow the Lord and to live according to what, the plans that He has for each of us. Anything else that you'd add about living like it's true?
I think that was a beautiful way to end it. I love that story.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Lara. It has been a rich conversation. And man, I just want to say to you, I hope you'll be faithful. I hope that you will take these gifts for writing and encouraging moms and, your experiences with anxiety and motherhood. I hope that you'll just take whatever talents that the Lord has entrusted to you. And I hope that you'll be faithful.
Thank you so much. And I pray the same for you. This has been such a joy to be on your podcast and to talk about one of my favorite passages.
Me too. It's one of my favorites. Let me just remind you that each story of the Bible is true. Collectively, these stories help us to know God and understand this true story that we are all part of. If you want to live like the true story is the true story, I've designed my false narrative watch list to help you identify and reject the world's lies, which are corrected by the truth of God's Word. This is a free download. There's a link in the show notes. It's going to help you take what we've discussed here on the podcast and live like it's true. We've also provided links for you to easily find our guests who have been here on the show. And I hope you'll also check out some of the resources that we've mentioned here in conversation. The links for all of those things are there for you in the show notes. Live Like It's True is part of the Resound Media Network. For more gospel-centered resources, go to resoundmedia.cc. Thanks to my son, Cade Popkin, for providing all of our music, and to my assistant, Katie Veenstra, who helps produce the show. And thanks to you for tuning in and for sharing this podcast with others. And now it's time to go live like it's true.